Thank you for joining us today for the inaugural annual keynote lecture of the MSU Foglio Speaker Series on Spirituality. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereignty of Michigan's 12 federally recognized Indian nations, for historic indigenous communities in Michigan, for indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and for those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold Michigan State University more accountable to the needs of American Indian and indigenous peoples. Additionally, I would like to thank today's co-sponsors, the Department of Religious Studies, the College of Arts and Letters, and the Michael and Elaine Serling Institute for Jewish Studies in Modern Israel. Initiated in honor of Father Jake Foglio, an alumnus, former faculty member, longtime priest, and mentor to countless MSU student athletes and coaches, the MSU Foglio Speaker Series on Spirituality offers the opportunity to explore the manifold meanings and applications of spirituality in the contemporary world through lectures, talks, workshops, and experiential events. This series aims to cultivate greater awareness of and appreciation for the many ways spirituality manifests across global religious cultures, interacts with public life, today's focus, and emerges as a secular orientation for pursuing meaning, purpose, and belongingness. In addition to a fall faculty lecture, a spring faculty talk and experience, which will begin next year, various co-sponsored events, and an annual keynote for which we gather today, each year also includes specific events and talks dedicated to highlighting the connection between spirituality, social justice, and diversity, equity, and inclusivity. This year, during the last week of March, we will hold a week-long series of events, including a roundtable discussion scheduled for Monday, March 28th on spirituality, anti-racism, and appropriation with Professor Simranjit Singh and our very own Professor Shrina Gandhi, a lecture on spirituality and anti-racism by Professor Anthea Butler on Wednesday, March 30th, consciousness-raising events in conjunction with citizen scholars, and a critical experience at the Broad Art Museum scheduled for Friday, April 1st. Throughout his work, teaching, and life, Father Jake stressed the value of extending beyond religious conversations to see spirituality in a secular light, consistently emphasizing the need to understand spirituality in relation to our base humanness. The MSU Foglio Speaker Series on Spirituality seeks to unpack how spirituality leads to and complicates this commitment to act humanly while attending to its religious, secular, and worldly applications. It offers space to consider how spirituality advances individual meaning and collective worldviews, all while attending to global flows of people, cultural knowledge, and religious traditions. Established to advance Father Jake's commitment to others, to the academic study of the human spirit, in relation to his efforts to expand understanding of spirituality beyond strictly religious concerns to the myriad ways humans seek meaning and define what matters most in their lives and to their communities, I could not be more thrilled to introduce today's keynote lecturer, Professor Philip Sheldrake. Professor Sheldrake has played an instrumental role in not only advancing the study of spirituality and my own work, but also, and much like Father Jake, expanding our frames of reference and understandings of spirituality into everyday life. In fact, in today's lecture, Professor Sheldrake will explore with us how the concept of spirituality means far more than simply spiritual practices such as meditation. Here I'm drawing from his abstract. Spirituality stands for everyday lifestyles that express a vision of our human existence and an aspirational approach to the meaning and conduct of human life. Importantly, spirituality relates to the fact that human life is fundamentally social and corporate in nature, rather than purely individual and inward looking. Hence, there's a deep and essential connection between spirituality and public life. Our shared life in society, which is a space of encounter, communication, and shared responsibilities. Today's talk will explore the most critical public values and virtues and how they may be effectively cultivated. Dr. Philip Sheldrake is professor and director of the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Spirituality, Oblate School of Theology, San Antonio, Texas, and also senior research associate, the Von Hugel Institute, St. Edmund's College, University of Cambridge. Professor Sheldrake trained in history and theology and was awarded the higher doctorate in 2015 by the University of Oxford. A fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, both in the UK, Professor Sheldrake specializes in the field of Christian spirituality from historical, theological, and applied perspectives. He is also a specialist more broadly in contemporary spirituality, especially its connection with healthcare and with place, identity, and urban studies. He's also interested in the history of Christianity, particular medieval and Reformation periods, in theological anthropology, social theology, interreligious, particularly Christian-Muslim dialogue, and in the interdisciplinary writings of Michel de Certeau. Author or editor of 18 books, Professor Sheldrake's monographs on spirituality include, among others, Spirituality in History, Questions of Interpretation and Method, 1998, Spirituality, A Very Brief Introduction, 2012, Spirituality, A Brief History, 2013, The Spiritual City, Theology, Spirituality in the Urban, 2014, Spirituality, A Guide for the Perplexed, 2014, and The Spiritual Way, Classical Traditions and Contemporary Practice, 2019. He is currently working on a book for Oxford University Press on Civility, Cultivating Public Virtues. In a very special connection, Father Jake was well known to cite from Professor Sheldrake's opus of writings in his own work, while fondly passing out copies of Professor Sheldrake's Spirituality, A Very Short Introduction. This is actually one of Father Jake's copies that he gave to me. A Q&A session for which I'll act as moderator will follow the talk. Please use that feature if you have any questions during the talk or after. And if you have any other issues, please feel free to reach out. Please join me in virtually welcoming Dr. Philip Sheldrake. I'll pass it over to you, Philip.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me.
I can hear you wonderfully, so I'm gonna go that we are all in the place.
Going to assume that everybody else has. Yeah. Okay. Great. Good to see you, Morgan. Well, thank you, Morgan, for that very kind introduction. I hope everybody can see me. It's a very strange experience talking via Zoom. You kind of speak out, assuming there are real people out there somewhere. Anyway, I'm very glad to see Morgan. At least there's a human person I can see. Anyway, thank you for coming to this talk. I speak from an increasingly dark and rather gloomy evening in London, UK, rather than physically face-to-face in Lansing, which would have been, I think, our preferred option. But there we are, hopefully in the future. Okay, so what I've agreed to talk about, I'm going to say this evening, but actually today would be better, is called Spirituality and Public Life. So I'll move ahead with that. Spirituality, as I'm sure many of you realize, is a subject that fascinates many people these days. And while the word is frequently used, its meaning is sometimes not very well defined. So what exactly do I think spirituality means? Even if the contemporary use of the word often separates it from religious beliefs, sufficient common features, I think, make it possible to suggest an overall definition of what spirituality stands for. So, briefly, spirituality for me refers to the deepest values and the sense of meaning by which people seek to live. It embraces lifestyles and practices that explicitly or implicitly embodies some kind of vision of human life and of how our human spirit may achieve its fullest, even transcendent potential. In other words, spirituality embraces an aspirational approach to the meaning and conduct of human life, whether this is seen in religious terms or not. As human beings, we're regularly driven by goals beyond material satisfaction to seek a deeper level of meaning and fulfillment. Historically, the origin of the word spirituality is explicitly Christian. It comes from the Latin noun spiritualitas, associated with an adjective spiritualis or spiritual. These words are themselves translations of New Testament Greek. For example, the noun pneuma or spirit and the adjective pneumatikos or spiritual, which appear in St. Paul's epistles. Importantly, in Paul's thinking, the notion of spirit and spiritual is not the opposite of physical, material, or bodily. Rather, it's the opposite of what in ancient terms they used to call fleshliness. This notion of fleshliness has a moral sense and refers to everything that is opposed to the divine spirit. So the intended contrast isn't between body and soul, but between two radically different attitudes to life. Thus, a spiritual person, for example, in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 2, is not someone who turns away from material reality or the body, but simply somebody who seeks to live under the influence of God's Spirit. Now, if we look beyond Christianity, we'll see that all the great world religions, which originate in different cultural contexts, developed a range of different words and ideas to express what we would nowadays call spirituality. The more widespread use of the actual word spirituality outside Western countries seems to have begun in the late 19th century, partly as a result of contacts between Europeans, particularly British people, and Hindu religious figures in India, because at that time, India, for better or for worse, was part of the British Empire. For example, the famous Hindu thinker Swami Vivekananda traveled a great deal outside India in the 1890s to speak to European and American audiences. In his talks, he praised the inherent spirituality, as he called it, of Indian culture and religion, and contrasted this favorably with what he saw as the serious limitations of Western thinking and behavior. If contemporary spirituality, broadly speaking, embodies a vision of human existence, it seems to me that there are four key elements. First, spirituality concerns what is holistic, that is to say, an integrated approach to life. And the basis for this is that historically, the notion of spirituality relates to another concept, that is holiness or the holy. In fact, the English word holy translates the ancient Greek word holos, which actually means much more than simply saintly. A holy person, according to that word, is really a holistic person. That is to say, someone who's not engaged only with one element in our human lives, but is dealing with the integrating factor of life. That is, experiencing and living life as a whole. Now, secondly, spirituality, as I understand it, engages with a quest for the sacred. Now, historically, the sacred in theistic religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is closely related to beliefs about God. However, nowadays in modern culture, modern Western culture anyway, the sacred often refers to much broader understandings of the numinous, sometimes embodied in nature or in the arts, or the undefined depths of human existence, or the boundless mysteries of the cosmos. Our third, spirituality relates to a search for meaning, for the overall purpose of life, and for a sense of life direction. In many ways, this responds to the decline of traditional religious, political, and social authority, particularly in Western countries. And finally, contemporary definitions of spirituality often connect to the desire for some sense of deeper values, in contrast to an instrumentalized or purely materialistic approach to life. This also means that spirituality promotes a self-reflective life rather than an unexamined life. So it overlaps in significant ways with ethics and with having a moral vision. Now I want to move on to the notion that human life is essentially social. I suggest that human life is fundamentally social rather than individualistic or inward-looking. Unfortunately, since the 19th century, Western culture, not least in the United Kingdom where I live, and the United States, has become deeply polarized. The private sphere, that's to say our inwardness, our family and friends, our home, has been idealized as the place where we can truly be ourselves before we take on different roles in public life. However, from a Christian perspective, at least, for example, public life is not simply a role that we take up or put down when we feel like it. The famous British theologian and religious thinker, who is also a former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, multiply published, suggests that we are seriously misled and even corrupted by seeing ourselves as essentially divided into an outside and an inside. with the inside being the true self, hidden and protected. On the contrary, he suggests, our human identity is created from the start through mutual communication and interaction with other people. An unbalanced focus on inwardness actually has serious moral consequences because it suggests that our life in public is of secondary importance. However, I want to suggest that specifically in Christian thinking, following the writings of the important early Christian writer and thinker Augustine of Hippo, there is no absolutely private identity. To be human embodies a common life and a common task. This is because there is an intimate link between how our human identity is to be understood and the Christian understanding of the divine or God, which Christianity defines as Trinity. The heart of the Christian understanding of human life is that we're all created by this God who's revealed in and through the life, work, and death of Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ. Christian theology and spirituality also suggests that God's Spirit dwells permanently within each of us and in all our lives. In Christianity, as I say, God is imaged as Trinity, that is to say, three persons in one God. So God should be thought of, in Christian terms, as persons in community, a mutuality of self-giving love. God's nature is to be relational, and our human lives reflect the nature of this relational God. From this perspective, being in communion with other people underpins human existence overall. To return to Augustine, the thinker, the early Christian thinker, importantly, he would have found the individualism that tends to pervade so much of our contemporary Western culture completely alien. In his contribution to the multi-author set of volumes, A History of Private Life, the great Augustine scholar Peter Brown reminds us that the earliest Christian approaches to human life, including Augustine's, inherited from late classical Judaism an intense sense of the vital solidarity between individual people and social community, that is to say, with public life. Jewish writers and Augustine saw the danger of people retreating into protected privacy rather than giving themselves wholeheartedly to the common good. Hence, both Jewish writers and Augustine turn their attention to the thoughts of the heart, because the heart was the supposed center of human motivation and action. Human life was inherently a state of solidarity with other people, expressed by the image of an undivided heart. For Augustine, especially his commentary on the Hebrew scripture book of Genesis, what is classically known in Judaism and Christianity as original sin was characterized as pleasing ourselves or living for ourselves only. In contrast, paradise would be a community in which there would be the fullness of mutual sharing. In other words, there will be no room in eternity for self-centered individualism or self-enclosed privacy. Added to this biblically inspired approach in Augustine was the fact that he was also deeply influenced by ancient philosophy, especially the writings of the Greek philosopher Aristotle and of the Roman Stoic Cicero. This philosophy suggested that we humans are essentially social beings rather than by nature freestanding individuals. Now I want to move on to how I understand public life, because the title of this talk is Spirituality and Public Life. So frequently, a lot of people seem to think that public life means only politics or public administration. However, properly understood, public life is something much broader. I suggest that it's an essential part of all our lives. Public life refers to our shared life in wider society, a space of encounter, communication, joint activities, and importantly, shared responsibilities. In this shared space, which is both a physical space and a social and moral space, we are formed and educated. Here, we explore our identities and discover a sense of meaning, including our values and important human virtues. I believe that it is vital for all of us to give serious attention to consciously embodying the public side of our human lives. This means committing ourselves intentionally to live out our values in the everyday world of neighborhood, street, and workplace by authentically engaging with other people. Unfortunately, as I've already noted, Western culture has become increasingly polarized, so that the private side of life is idealized as a context where we are most truly ourselves. However, I've also suggested that, for example, from a Christian perspective, living in public is not something we simply choose to do when we feel like it. Our human lives involve other people with whom we not only share a common space, but also a common task. There's a famous English private school, high school, called St. Albans School, with which my family had close connections in the past. It's one of the oldest schools in the world, originally founded by Benedictine monks in the 12th century of the Common Era. The reason I mention this is because the school has a motto in Latin, non nobis nati. That is, we are not born for ourselves. This motto comes from a family linked to St. Albans Abbey, which before the Reformation ran the school. However, the motto ultimately originates in the writings of the Roman statesman and Stoic philosopher, whom I've already mentioned, Cicero. He wrote, non nobis solum nati sumus. That is, in English, we are not born for ourselves alone. This appears in his treatise on duties. Apologies, I want to quote, but Cicero uses exclusively male language typical of his time. So here we are. We are not born for ourselves alone, to use Plato's splendid words, but our country claims for itself one part of our birth and our friends another part. Moreover, as the Stoics believe, everything produced on earth is created for the use of mankind, and men are born for the sake of other men, so that they may be able to assist one another. Consequently, we ought in this to follow nature as our leader, to contribute to the common stock of things that benefit everyone together, and by the exchange of dutiful services, by giving and receiving expertise and effort and means to bind fast the fellowship of men with each other. In terms of living a public life, what does this mean? The well-known American social anthropologist Lynn Loughlin, concerned with a growing anti-public rhetoric in Western societies, uses the word public to refer to contexts that are shaped by the interaction of people who only know each other casually. Public contexts are very different from the intimacy of our private worlds. Thinking again about Christianity, it's interesting that the New Testament Gospels frequently suggest that God is most powerfully experienced in contexts that are strange to us, rather than safe and familiar. Jesus is described in the Gospels as regularly pushing his followers away from familiar contexts towards places that felt initially very threatening, because the people who lived there were either from a different race or from a different religion. In other words, they were other. Public life is a space where very different people have to establish some kind of common existence. This includes casual encounters on the streets and less casual, but not necessarily intimate, social mixing in, for example, sports clubs, local cafes, or places of worship. Living in public implies learning how to be hospitable to what's different, unfamiliar, and even sometimes instinctively feared. This is part of the vital process of reinforcing a sense of who I am and collectively who we are. I suggest that this process of establishing a shared public life may be seen as a form of spiritual practice, just as important as meditation. The problem is that public life is nowadays not always seen as a spiritual reality, because the spiritual, I put that in parentheses, is associated less with the street and more generally with our inner selves or with our self-chosen community networks. As an environment of strangers who are unacquainted with each other or who occupy different social and cultural worlds, public life was until recently interpreted by many social commentators as essentially barren. Life within it was presumed to be incidental and unreflective. For this reason, shared values and a genuinely common purpose were not thought to be possible. This has begun to change. In recent years, I've been privileged to take part in conversations in the United States and in the United Kingdom with architects, urban planners, and city mayors about what makes the good neighborhood or the good city. Interestingly, given that many of the conversation partners are not explicitly religious, there is an increasing interest in discussing the spiritual side of these questions. In this context, a contemporary Catholic social ethicist at Georgetown University in DC, Dave Hollenbach, offers some interesting insights. These are based partly on the spirituality tradition associated with Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, who technically run Georgetown University, the important 16th century spiritual figure who is known especially for his famous spiritual exercises. David Hollenbach suggests that in contemporary diverse societies, our public life is always an ongoing process. It's never complete because it's the product of multiple negotiations on the street corner, as he puts it. Now, David Hollenbach raises some very down-to-earth questions. The size and radically mixed nature of today's urban environments, cities and towns, important expressions of what we mean by public life, make the achievement of solidarity much more challenging than it used to be in the past. So is it even possible to recover a sense of the common good? I'll return to that notion of the common good in a moment. But in summary, can people of different backgrounds identify aspects of the good life that they agree are desirable? Is the best we can hope for in our public life a passive tolerance of irreconcilable differences? For example, people of a different age, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, social status, or religion? Hollenbach believes that we can do better than mere tolerance. He offers a challenging defense of the validity in contexts of diversity of seeking the common good. This can only come about through persistent negotiation. So for David Hollenbach, negotiation is a central characteristic of public life. It's not a quick fix. However, what matters more than a guaranteed successful outcome is the solidarity that grows from committing ourselves to the challenging process of creating shared values and negotiating a common spiritual and ethical language. In practice, such a spiritual process is necessarily ongoing, open-ended. I now want to move on to outline a few specific spiritual values that I believe are particularly important in developing a genuinely public life. I'll begin with the idea of the common good, which I've already mentioned. I will then move on to the social virtue known as civility, and then to the theme of community, and finally to the importance of reconciliation, which I believe embraces hospitality and human solidarity. So first of all, the common good. The idea of the common good is closely associated with the Greek philosopher Aristotle. In his approach to human knowledge, one of his categories is what he calls practical wisdom or prudent judgment. For Aristotle, practical wisdom isn't abstract. but it comes from our intuition, our imagination, our emotional engagement, and our desire. Importantly, Aristotle saw practical wisdom as related particularly to our public life. Its aim was to promote the common good. He suggests that this kind of wisdom grows in and through our immersion in everyday social contexts. In his Nicomachean Ethics, an important work, he's clear that human beings actually need relationships with other people in order to be fully human. What's distinctive about being human is that our true fulfillment goes beyond purely individual satisfaction. Aristotle contrasts self-seeking with true self-love, which is related to the quest for what he calls real friendship and true society. A fulfilled life is not just pleasurable, but in his words, is also noble because it involves a degree of self-giving. In this context, the common good implies that a truly good life is directed towards what's shared with other people. What is truly good for me cannot be separated from what is truly good for you. And what is good for both of us directs us towards what is good for everyone. This is the common good. And it's not just a pragmatic arrangement, but it expresses something essential about being human. Seeking the good for everyone rather than just my own good is, in Aristotle's words, nobler and more divine. This is picked up by the early Christian writer Augustine, whom I've already mentioned, who adds one or two interesting features. For Augustine, the common good is not just a social value, but is also a spiritual value. Therefore, the common good, as the highest human good, involves a movement away from self-seeking. Augustine reminds us not to forget the unique value of each person around us. However, we need to balance that carefully with the needs of individual people with the good of the whole. This demands the challenging spiritual value of self-forgetfulness. Not easy. My second value is civility, and related to public life. Interestingly, Jeb Bush, the Republican former governor of Florida, suggested some years ago that to respond to contemporary public and political dysfunctions, it was critical for us to recover the virtue of civility. Now, civility implies far more than just being polite or having good manners. It expresses our commitment in public life to mutual respect and to cooperation. The origins of the word civility lie in the Latin word civitas, which is citizenship, a body of people who create an organized public community. So civility is both a moral and a spiritual value that demands that we seek to become free from self-absorption and to develop empathy, humility, integrity, honesty, and respect for other people in a shared public life. The first American president, George Washington, created what became known as 110 rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation. Interestingly, he drew these, or based them, on spiritual guidelines originally composed in the late 16th century by French members of the Catholic religious order I've already mentioned, the Jesuits. George Washington's first rule was, I quote, "Every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those that are present." Here, civility clearly implied more than just being polite. We may disagree with each other, but we must not lose mutual respect. We should seek sufficient common ground to have a dialogue about our social differences. At the heart of this dialogue is the need to listen, to question our own preoccupations, and to enable other people to do the same. As George Washington affirmed in his rules, we need, I quote, "to disagree without being disagreeable." The late Jonathan Sacks, Dr. Jonathan Sacks, a very significant Jewish philosopher and the former British chief rabbi, who died not very long ago, sadly, offers many rich insights about civility, about which he wrote. First, we need to believe that it's possible to achieve the common good. However, civility also involves, according to Jonathan Sachs, the spiritual value of self-sacrifice in order to live together effectively. To practice civility needs altruism, a sense of self that's expressed in the service of others. This is vital if I am truly to belong rather than simply to inhabit the public world. To belong means being concerned for the welfare of others. Public life necessarily involves disagreements about our behavior and values, but civility invites us to negotiate these disagreements while relating to each other. Even in the absence of explicitly shared values or beliefs, we're part of the same moral and spiritual universe. As Rabbi Sachs noted, cohesion in public life needs self-restraint. This is a form of discipline that sadly has ceased to be a key spiritual value in much of contemporary Western society. And finally, turning briefly to Chinese thinking, Confucianism is another ancient philosophy that promotes moral and spiritual values directed at a shared public life. Confucius, who lived in the 1st century before the Common Era, emphasized the virtues of humaneness, decorum, and civility. These shape an ethical framework for human relations by creating the truly noble person. According to Confucius, a harmonious society begins with well-ordered families, whose influence then spreads into the wider public world. For Confucius, cosmic harmony is to be reflected in our daily lives, and thus civility, in his words, is a virtue that relates to true humanity. My third value related to public life is building community. Creating a sense of community is a critical public value. This isn't comfortable. As you've already seen in Christian thinking, human identity is essentially social. To be fully human is to exist in community. As Augustine's writings suggest, there's no such thing as a purely private self. This understanding contrasts strongly with contemporary emphases on the unique importance of individual choice. I suggest that central to a spiritual framework for building community are the related themes of commitment, coexistence, and communication, including developing shared convictions. In terms of communication, in his 2020 encyclical letter Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis emphasizes the importance of dialogue as the basis for public life. Basically, we need to talk to each other in order to build friendship in society, to reach consensus, to recover kindness, and to genuinely acknowledge other people. This view echoes Aristotle's ideas about the primacy of speech in public life. Paradoxically, true communication also includes the value of silence, understood as the absence of destructive speech. This is expressed strongly, for example, in the concept of taciturnitas, as it appears in the famous monastic Rule of St. Benedict. The rule suggests that truly listening to other people involves silence so that we may learn from others. So being taciturn consists of far more than just being quiet. It involves being careful not to come across to other people as too dominating. Community implies associating with others in a creative and inclusive way. Such relationships are genuinely committed rather than a question of superficial contact. In his essay, Civic Spirit, on rethinking society and the common good, the British social commentator Charles Ledbetter highlights the values of mutuality and reciprocity. In Christian ideas of community, the concept of being in communion, or koinonia, as they say it in Greek, embraces fellowship, everyday sharing, mutual dependence, self-giving, and solidarity. Our spirituality is expressed not only in our relationship with the divine, but also in relating to each other and to the wider natural world. In summary, a fully developed human community demands mutual commitment, a quest for shared values, and a degree of self-sacrifice. The deepest call in public community is to honor everyone equally, and not merely those who are like us or from whom we can gain some benefit. This leads me to my fourth and final spiritual value in public life, reconciliation. In my view, reconciling our differences is not the same as promoting artificial sameness. So what does the word reconciliation actually mean? I think it means more than mere tolerance as a pragmatic arrangement. Tolerance means learning to live alongside other people while avoiding the kind of significant engagement with each other that might actually change us. Human reconciliation implies a complicated balance between making the necessary structural changes in public life to overcome social dysfunctions, such as violence on the streets, and seeking a deeper spiritual harmony. Reconciliation isn't cheap because it involves truth-telling and also promoting justice. A number of difficult questions need to be faced. First, what exactly is it to be reconciled? In public life, are we just talking about equally valid but opposing viewpoints? Or are there deeper moral and spiritual issues? If so, simply maintaining neutrality and consensus building isn't enough. Second, how is reconciliation related to justice? Everyone in our shared public life may agree that justice is always important. However, what justice actually means will be seen very differently depending on our place, our personal place in the prevailing social power system. Third, is bad behavior on the streets endemic in our current social and public systems? How can we readjust, or must our whole public system be rethought? Fourth, what is the true nature of social conflict? Is it simply political, social, cultural, ethnic, or religious, or is it a mixture of everything? Conflict always involves issues of power, and so reconciliation must imply a genuine redistribution of social power in all areas of our public life, and this can't be just theoretical. I now want to briefly highlight two spiritual values that I believe are central to genuine reconciliation: hospitality and solidarity. And for these, I refer once again to Western monastic spirituality. First, the rule of St. Benedict has a great deal to offer in terms of promoting reconciliation in our public world. Human reconciliation is closely related to the key spiritual value of hospitality, as it's taught by the rule of St. Benedict. Chapter 53 of the rule states that everyone who turns up should be received as if they were Christ. I'm going to say it in Latin: omnes supervenientes hospites tamquam Christus suscipiantur. And the rule goes on to connect receiving Christ with the phrase, I was a stranger and you took me in. This implies a spirituality that's deeper than just being friendly to a passing visitor. The word supervenientes literally means those who arrive, but it implies those who turn up unexpectedly in our life. This isn't just people we didn't expect to meet, but those who are a surprise to us in a more disturbing way. We're not to be choosy about whom we keep company with, really is the meaning behind it. The word hospites is nicely ambiguous. It means guests or visitors, but it can also be translated as strangers, and particularly in the light of the reference in the rule to Christ's words in the Gospel of Matthew, I was a stranger and you took me in. And finally, the word suscipiantur literally means to be received. So those who come are to be received, but the deeper sense of suscipiantur is to be loved or cherished. So strangers we encounter in our public lives are people who, while different from us, we must learn to value as if they were one of our own circle of friends and family. Finally, what about solidarity? This implies a sense of unity between people that counters inequality and the experience of not belonging. The highly popular American spiritual writer and monk, Thomas Merton, retained a strong sense of solidarity with people on the streets. Some of his most engaging comments about human solidarity appear in a 1967 essay, The Street is for Celebration. Here, Merton powerfully outlined the difference between people inhabiting public space and people merely existing in it. I quote, "When a street is like a tunnel, a passage, a tube from some place to someplace else, the people who live on it don't really live on it. The street is not where they live, but where they've been dumped." Somebody says, the street is everybody's public street. All right, is it? The conditions are such that you don't feel it's your street because you're not safe, you're not wanted, you're not even noticed. The people who are merely provisionally present must now become really present on the street as themselves. They must be recognizable as people. Hence, they must recognize each other as people. Instead of submitting to the street, they must aim to change it. In this talk, I've mentioned ancient philosophy plus Christian and Jewish thought. However, I want to underline that a deep connection between spirituality, this is as a conclusion, between spirituality and public life exists in all major religions. For example, in Hinduism, one of its best known spiritual figures, whom I've already mentioned, Swami Vivekananda, taught that serving our fellow humans, particularly the poor or the marginalized, is to serve God. Serving others is the deepest meaning of spirituality beyond religious ritual. In Buddhism, the famous monk and spiritual writer Thich Nhat Hanh, who also died recently, inspired a movement called Engaged Buddhism, which promotes strong public values related, for example, to social justice. In Islam, the 5 basic spiritual practices known as the pillars of Islam include zakat, or almsgiving. All who are able should share their wealth with the poor as a pathway to eliminating inequality in public life. Now, to end this talk, I want to return briefly to the importance of practical wisdom as we seek to connect spirituality with public life. I mentioned this earlier in relation to the spiritual value of seeking the common good. Practical wisdom has been related historically to the spiritual value known as discernment. In Christian spirituality, from the early desert ascetics, for example, in the writings of John Cassian, to Ignatius Loyola's 16th century spiritual exercises, discernment, discretion, is intended to help us instinctively to recognize our deepest truth in daily life, including public life. In everyday language, a discerning person is someone who is able to tell the difference between things and to separate them. Spiritual discernment invites us to reflect critically on our ambiguous everyday experience in public life in order to be able to choose, or increasingly to choose well. Public life continually faces us with difficult choices. We need to learn how to tell the difference between what will lead us in a life-giving direction and what is spiritually flawed and will lead us in destructive directions. Becoming discerning people enables us increasingly to live productively and at peace, not only with ourselves, but with other people who share this space that we call public life.